Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's OBI Public Talk called Exploring the Brain-Gut Axis. My name is Tom Mickelson. I'm the President and Scientific Director of the Ontario Brain Institute, or OBI as it's known. Before we begin, though, as with all of our events, I'd like to acknowledge that the St. James Cathedral and the OBI offices are located in the Tuck Toronto, the Indigenous name for Toronto, meaning the place in the water where the trees are standing. These are, of course, the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today, this land is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. So we're grateful to live, work, and learn here, and we affirm our responsibility to engage in the spirit of reconciliation. So tonight's talk, we have a really excellent group of panelists that are going to talk about how the gut microbiomes and other signaling of the enteric nervous system influence things like neurodevelopment, neuroinflammation, and neurodegeneration, disorders which affect many folks that we're in our families and in our population. This knowledge can be used to inform how we translate care into folks dealing with various neurologic conditions. So, exploring the gut-brain axis is the first event in a new series we call Breakthroughs in Brain Science. This is designed to highlight the impact of our team science approach in Ontario, the brain health ecosystem, which consists of researchers, commercialization vendors, and other partners, and our growing role in national and global brain health movements. And we'll have other programs to talk about those in more detail. So since our founding in 2010, we have this team science model. We bring together researchers, clinicians, tech experts, community organizations, and folks living with lived experience. We have shown that we've been able to accelerate innovation in neuroscience, driven by this mission to improve the lives of the 1 in 3 Ontarians living with a brain disorder. Tonight, we are really thrilled to have a special guest offering insights on the province's research landscape. And it's my pleasure to present the Honorable Nolan Quinn, who is the Minister of Colleges, Universities, Research Excellence, and Security. So Minister Quinn, welcome.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Mickelson, for that kind introduction. I'd like to start by thanking the Ontario Brain Institute for hosting this event and their fantastic public talk series. When 1 in 3 Ontarians will be impacted by a brain disorder at some point in their lives, events like today's are so important. They provide us great opportunity to learn from experts who are dedicated to improving the health and well-being of our residents. Every day in Ontario, groundbreaking research is taking place that saves lives and drives our economy forward. OBI is a prime example of Ontario's incredible capacity for research excellence. Your initiatives like NERV, NERD, and integrated discovery programs not only foster new innovations, partnerships, and discoveries, but they also are delivering impressive results for the people of Ontario and beyond. To date, these programs have supported over 100 innovative companies, bringing 26 new products related to brain health to the market. And with each company that is created and each product brought to market, OBI is improving people's health, creating jobs, and strengthening our economy. Our government will always support made in Ontario homegrown research. Since 2018, our government has invested over $906 million into 1,600 research projects, leveraging more than $1.3 billion in funding from federal and third-party contributions. Thanks to our government's investment, we've trained more than 120,000 highly qualified personnel, established more than 400 new patents, and created almost 600 new rewarding careers across the province. And as part of Budget 2025, we're building on our previous investments by providing $207 million to equip our researchers with competitive infrastructure to attract top talent and leverage federal funding. We know Ontario is home to some of the brightest minds in the world, and our government is taking decisive action to ensure our researchers have the support they need to propel Ontario's critical industries forward and strengthen our province. Which is why since 2018, our government has been proud to support OBI as a core part of our research initiatives. most recently with an investment of $65 million to continue groundbreaking work on brain health. As a global leader in brain research, I look forward to all of the life-changing developments that OBI will accomplish for the people of Ontario through this investment. In closing, I want to thank Kevin and Mike for their incredible leadership at Ontario Brain Institute. Whether it's developing treatments or bringing people together for critical conversation like today's, OBI plays a vital role in furthering our province's excellence and our province's health. Our government knows that when we invest in research, we invest in a brighter future for all of Ontario. And we're proud to partner with this wonderful organization. And thank you, and enjoy the talk tonight.
Thank you, Minister Quinn. So this is a great opportunity to kick off the proceedings and get the conversation started. So it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Olivia Go-Swaby. Olivia is a postdoc at Western, where she researches how obesity and diabetes affect brain functions in older adults. She's also a gifted science communicator, as you'll see in a moment, skilled at making complex ideas understanding, and just an ideal and perfect fit for tonight's discussion. So, Olivia, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm really excited for today's conversation and discussion, which of course includes all of you. Here as a moderator, my job is to facilitate discussion with our panelists, who will join us on the stage shortly, and take in all the questions that you may have as an audience member. So for those watching online, tune to your screen. You'll find or have the opportunity to send any questions to us using the function on the right side of your screen. And there you can also email us through communications@braininstitute.ca. For those here in person, you should see on the screen as well, you can, raise your hand to ask a question, and you'll have a sheet in front of you that you'll be able to write your question into, and then someone along the outside of this area they're waving their hands, will pick up your question and send it over to me so that I can ask it with our great panelists. Or you can use a QR code on the screen to answer or send in any questions you have, as well as email communications@braininstitute.ca. All right, so let's get to the exciting part. Let's introduce our panelists. First up, we've got Dr. Premysl Bercik. He's a professor at the Department of Medicine and member of the Farncombe Family Digestive Health Research Institute at McMaster University. His clinical interest lies in functional bowel disorders or disorders of the brain-gut axis, intestinal dysmotility, gastroparesis, and celiac disease. His basic research focuses on the role of intestinal bacteria in the gut-brain axis in the context of gut function, low-grade inflammation and behavior, including anxiety and depression. So welcome on stage here.
Thank you.
Next up, we've got Dr. Valerie Taylor. She's a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Calgary. Prior to this, she was the chief of psychiatry at Women's College Hospital and the chief of adult health services at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. Her academic focus has been on the area of medical psychiatry, with a focus on biomarkers and an interest in the gut-brain axis and the area of the gut microbiome. She's also the CEO of Tailored Biotherapeutics, a drug discovery startup as well. And then finally, we have Dr. Chao Wang. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Immunology at the University of Toronto and a scientist at the Sunnybrook Research Institute. As the Canada Research Chair in Immunometabolism of Neuroinflammation, she looks at the dynamic role of the immune system in the progression of neurological disorders, such as major depression and autism spectrum disorder. Her team focuses on understanding how stress impacts the brain in such contexts and identifying factors that can promote stress resilience. So welcome on stage with us. Let's have a round of applause to start this off. Again, thank you, audience members, for joining us today. I'm sure I speak for many when I say that I'm very, very keen to explore this connection between the gut and the brain. It's something I think about when I eat my meal in the morning and then feel a little iffy and like, what's going on today? And then everything shifts in my mentality throughout the day. I'd like to learn maybe more about what that connection is. And of course, this is a hot topic. We all want to learn a little bit more. And I think it's important that we define it, unpack it, and debunk some of the things that we may see on the internet. So without further ado, let's get started. My first question is actually for Chao here. I want to start with the basics. Let's understand it. Tell us about how the brain and gut work together.
Absolutely. Such a pleasure. So the gut-brain axis actually describes an interaction between nerve cells and microbes. It's very evolutionarily conserved. And in fact, it can be found in species that don't even have a brain. So don't be fooled by the name gut-brain axis. To give you an example, you might have heard of hydra, which is a freshwater polyps. And it's probably best known in popular science that it has a really, really long longevity. Some of the polyps are known to live over 1,000 years. And so, of course, we don't really truly understand why they have such good longevity, but I do know that they have very good gut-brain axis. And so these polyps actually have their nerve cells secrete a factor called neuropeptides. And these neuropeptides will dictate what kind of microbes that get to live on them. And in exchange, these chosen ones have to work hard for the host. So they actually have to pump and help the hydra doing contractions, which help them getting food. So now back to human beings, which we all care about very much. Is of course, we're not hydra, but we do have an operational gut-brain axis that's very much, in principle, very similar, just extremely more complex and have more components. So for one, we do have a brain different from a hydra, and that's really sitting very distant from where all our microbes are, which is in our digestive system. And the second thing is we have the gut, and you might have used the term gut feelings. It's very much true and correct scientifically because the gut contains over 500 million nerve cells. And then thirdly, we have a component of microbes, right? So we have actually over 10 trillion microbial cells that lives in our gut system. Now, the last component I will introduce, which you might not necessarily click in general thinking, and when you think about the gut-brain axis, which is the immune system, and that's what I study. So backtrack about 70 years, we actually thought the brain is very much privileged, and it doesn't have any immune cells. But now we've recognized that not only there's abundant of immune cells sitting in the brain, there's even very specialized structures called the meninges, and that's right underneath the skull, that's very rich in immune cells, where they kind of protect it from infections, and or if there's injuries, it can help repair process. There's also immune cells in our gut system that's interspersed between the microbes and the gut intestine. So as you can imagine, the gut-brain axis has 4 different components, trillions of cells that they have to communicate with each other. And it's really a scientific front to discover what are the communication, what are some of the means that they actually talk to each other. And some might be really good for us and benefit us in terms of survival and health, and some might not be so great. Mm-hmm. And to give you an example, just about 2 weeks ago, there's an article published in Science that shows the immune cells can actually make the nerve cell work for them by instructing them to help prevent helminth infection, which is normally a function of the immune cells. So think of this as a whole ecosystem, right? You've got outsiders, microbes, you've got your internal gut system, you've got the immune cells. They have to cooperate with each other and kind of create a symbiotic environment. And when any parts of that goes wrong, that can cause problems. And I'm sure we'll hear a lot about the disease. The last thing I kind of want to touch upon of the gut-brain axis is that I always wondered, it's such a big corporation, so it could easily become chaotic, right? So is there a component that kind of have a blueprint of all these things and make sure everything works in order? And there's a really exciting area of research where people use a technique called neuron tracing, where they discover specific parts of our brain actually has the power to control the blueprint and how the gut-brain axis works. And so I want to end that there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect way to talk about how it's all so connected with all the 4 different components you mentioned. And then, of course, what does that look like on a greater scale? So I think that's a great transition into Premysl here. I've heard you say that many disorders, including brain-related conditions, start in the gut and manifest into digestive symptoms. What are you seeing in your work and how the gut and brain influence each other?
So I may be biased because I'm gastroenterologist, so of course I think that all the diseases start in the gut, and if not all, at least most of them. Mm-hmm. But you already heard, I mean, that there is the gut or the digestive system plays an important role even for our behavior, how the brain works, not only by providing the nutrients, but there is always this bidirectional communication between the 2 organs. And you can see it. You can see it in patients. You can see it even in healthy individuals. I mean, we already heard the butterflies in the stomach. So students, when they are just before their exams, they will have these strange feelings in their abdomen, the butterflies in the stomach, and this is probably mediated by the stress. And we know that stress can, for example, worsen many of these chronic gastrointestinal diseases. Me personally, I'm interested in disorders of gut-brain interaction. Among them, the irritable bowel syndrome is probably the most common one. And we know that the central factors play an important role. So stress, anxiety, depression can worsen the gastrointestinal symptoms. And also many patients in whom the problems originate in the gut will develop psychiatric comorbidities, whether it's anxiety or depression. So there is a clear link between what is happening in the gut and how we feel.
And sometimes you don't think about that connection, like the anxiety and potentially depression coming from what's happening in your gut. So that's really interesting. I mean, it'll be definitely a topic that many will ask about throughout today, and I'll ask you more. And then kind of more moving to the psychiatric side, so we talked about it from the gut aspect. This is for you, Valerie. I have a question just to start things off. For you, how does the gut influence mental health?
Well, as was mentioned, it's bidirectional, so there's a communications. Your gut impacts your brain impacts your gut. You know, one of the ways in which we think about medications working, for example, to treat mental illness is via things like changing neurotransmitter levels in your brain. And it's very funny. And so we think about serotonin, for example. You have more serotonin receptors in your GI system than you do in your brain. And so maybe it's not actually the brain that these medications are working on, but they're actually working within your GI system. We know that many of the bacteria that live in your GI system, for example, that they're responsible for breaking down medication, they're responsible for producing things like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. Those are the brain chemicals that psychiatric medications are designed to target, to increase or to decrease, because it's thought that an imbalance in those chemicals are related to illness. But again, maybe it's the bacteria that's in your GI system and not your brain first that's actually part of that. And I know in talking, I'm a psychiatrist, and in talking to many of my patients, they will very strongly kind of state that a lot of their illnesses, when they become depressed, their GI system goes off. And you know, all of us see that ourselves in times of stress. We start to see, as was mentioned, GI distress. We see lots of changes in your gut, and those two areas are very tightly connected, and we're only now starting to understand how this concept of gut dysbiosis or bacteria just not being at optimal levels actually impacting not just GI illness, but brain-based illnesses as well, which for me is pretty exciting because it opens up a lot of possibilities for treatments that haven't been explored previously.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, the treatment aspect, again, I'm going to ask you more about it because I'm very curious as well. I think we touch on a few terms, microbes, bacteria in the stomach and the gut. Premysl, can you describe for us like what this gut microbiome is, for example, and how they're connected to the brain?
So, gut microbiome, it's a complex community and contains not only bacteria, but it contains archaea, protozoa, viruses, fungi, and they all live usually they live in harmony, right? So it's a symbiosis. And each of us will have anywhere from half a kilogram to 2 kilograms of microbiome, or mainly bacteria, in our bowels. And we have to think about it as a very important metabolic organ. So bacteria or the microbiome can, in many cases, is actually involved in the metabolism of common medications, but it helps us in obtaining proper nutrition from the diet. Mm-hmm. It helps to protect against infections. And definitely it affects also other organs apart from the gut. So it has been well described that the gut bacteria are to great degree responsible for the gut function. So whether if there is a shift, it can result in diarrhea or constipation. We have accumulating data showing that gut bacteria are also responsible or controlling the pain perception. And then there is this signaling towards the brain. And it can happen through many pathways. It has been already mentioned, the immune system. We know that the neural system is actually sensing what is in the gut. So there are several pathways, including the vagus nerve. And the bacteria are already, as you heard, bacteria can produce basically all the neuroactive substances which you can find in the human body. So the bacteria can produce, serotonin, histamine, and all this will affect how we feel and how we function.
Yes, I'm thinking about that word ecosystem, how important it is to take care of it. And then I kind of want to think what happens when that gets disturbed. So going to Chao, based on your research, what have you seen breaks down that brain-gut axis?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I want to focus on is actually talk about the one of the really fundamental factors for the breakdown, which is something we're all familiar with, inflammation. And I will talk about what can cause inflammation, but first I want to define the term a little bit. I think all of us think about inflammation as an enemy, right? It gives us swelling, redness, pain, dysfunction. But at the bottom of it, an inflammation is actually required for our immune system to fight infections. It's needed for wound healing. So it's not really the main culprit. So when does it go wrong, right? When do you have excess inflammation? And I can think of probably two scenarios where there's one where you actually have a real threat. You have a trauma, you have injury to deal with, you have an infection, but something goes wrong with the brake system in your immune cells. And that's when they go when uncontrollable and cause more inflammation than needed. Second scenario is you can actually have inflammation where there's no real threat, and it's absolutely pathological. A very good example of this is a disease called multiple sclerosis. And that's when your own immune system decided, oh, here's the myelin, which is a component of your nervous system. I'm going to attack it because I think mistakenly that's an enemy. So that creates an inflammation. So when this type of inflammation happens when it's near the brain or the gut, it absolutely would cause breakdown of the gut-brain axis. In some more severe situations, you would even have a syndrome called a leaky gut, which you might have heard of. And so you have these little holes. And this is not so great for us because it leads to leakage of microbial products into the system and can even cause spreading of inflammation, right? So inflammation is good, but it can go bad. And so what can cause inflammation? Some of it are sort of the usual suspects, right? You have infection, you have tumor, you have a trauma, you can have inflammation. Some of them, the causes are actually a little less controllable. Unfortunately, as we all age, you also have increased level of inflammation. But then there are things that we could control. And this is something that I'm very interested in, is lifestyle. Right? When you have a poor night's of sleep, inflammation is going to go up. When you have a stressful life event that kind of outbalances your relaxation techniques, then absolutely that's going to overload your system. Many studies have shown that a little bit of stress is actually good. It's actually anti-inflammatory. But when you have abundance of it, then that causes the cells that can listen to these cues for stopping no longer working. It's called some type of exhaustion in a way at the cellular level. And so this is an area that we're extremely interested in. So I think from our studies, we've been using advanced technology called a single-cell RNA sequencing and ATAC-seq. So what this does, it allows us to look at the communication that I talked about earlier of the gut-brain axis at a very, very refined level. We can look at an individual cell level and look at genes and pathways and pick out what's really wrong when stress hits us. And the goal is, of course, to identify ways that you can promote this resilience and hopefully to help those that have a problem balancing it out with lifestyle choices.
Awesome. Yeah, the idea of resilience and thinking about what lifestyle choices is part of that can help support gut health as well as brain health is really important. And kind of touching on that, it's going a little bit outside of our script here, just because I saw a really good question from the audience that I wanted to address. Is there any connection, so that early life trauma piece, as to how some of these gut as well as brain disorders potentially manifest? And is there a little bit of a sex-based effect in there too?
Oh my goodness, that's absolutely. So early life stress, there's now a really good amount of data supporting that's a major cause of neurodevelopmental disorders, and it can also cause brain disorders later in life. How do you handle that? And I think it's a question for all of us to think about. I think the reason early life stress has such a major impact is because that's when your brain is still developing. A really important immune cell type called microglial cells are actually still actively growing up and doing their job, pruning the synapses of the brain, helping them mature. And that's the time sort of is early life for us. And so if you are hit with trauma, then that process is disrupted. And so you don't have a fully mature nervous system as we speak. And so it's a lot more difficult to tackle later in life. And you brought up the sex piece, and I love that question. I think it had been overlooked in the research realm for a very, very long time, but now thanks to all the institutional funding agencies, it's being brought back into center stage. Within my research of stress, it's night and day. There's not a single response that we are seeing are identical between males and females. Their drug response is very different to antidepressants. The way that you can manipulate, even the cells that are responding to these are different. And so there are actually studies in the psychiatry world by analyzing the brains. It turns out that the man, their response to sort of depression and that kind of mental disorder is more manifested in GABAergic neurons and a type of supporting glial cells called astrocytes. But if you look at females, women who have psychiatric disorders, the biggest difference they can find is in immune cells, in the microglial cells that I just mentioned. So there's a really profound sex bias, I think, all the way from etiology to treatment response, and we should seriously think about that when we think about treatment.
Awesome, yeah. And then now that we're kind of touching on treatment, I wanted to turn to Valerie and your work, especially some of the content discovery, working with different therapies. Any GI-based treatments address the mental health side of things for that gut-brain axis connection?
That's been the whole focus of, I think, the last few years of my research. And one of the things about your gut microbiome that's important to know is that we have trillions of bacteria that are in and on us. And if you actually look at the amount of kind of bacterial genetic material versus human genetic material, it's about 150 to 1. So we actually have more bacterial genome than human genome. So just kind of sit and think about that for a sec, right? Who's actually making the decisions now? It can really start to get a bit creepy, for sure. But the exciting thing is that you can manipulate it. We can change our gut microbiome. It is something that we can change, we can have impact on, and that's been a focus of us looking at different treatments. And so certainly, there's a variety. You have, depending on the behaviors you're trying to change, there's a focus on foods, and people will talk about different functional foods and high fiber foods that are feeding the healthy bacteria. And that's part of what makes the bacteria healthy, is breaking down some of these foods into things like short chain fatty acids, which are required for many things, including brain growth. And so depending on the food you eat, you might be able to impact health in that way. That's why many of us feel better when we eat a certain way, and we don't feel so good when we eat a different way. There's been a lot of talk about different probiotics. Now, probiotics are not meant to actually change the bacteria that are in your GI system, but certainly people have been looking at if taking a probiotic can help treat mental illness. I would say the role of probiotics is perhaps more around keeping a person well once they are well, as opposed to actually being able to get you well if you're ill. We've been more interested more recently in fecal transplant, and we were one of the very few groups that were doing fecal transplant for mental illness. And we started actually a study at Women's College involved Mount Sinai and UHN as well. And part of the reason that we started to explore that area of research was that there were fascinating animal studies where we looked at, people looked at germ-free mice. And some of that work was done in McMaster as well. People looked at germ-free mice, which are mice that don't have their own innate immune system. And what they did was they transferred stool from humans into these mice. So they took stool from people with depression and transferred it into these mice. These mice started to have what we call depressive-like behaviors. They started to mimic some of the symptoms we see in humans with depression. Same thing's been done with anxiety, with autism, with a variety of psychiatric illnesses. And so we were very much intrigued by this, because if you could transfer illness, our focus is perhaps you can transfer wellness. And so we've been looking at the opposite, taking stool from humans who are remarkably healthy and transplanting that into individuals who are unwell with depression or anxiety. We now have studies looking at OCD and ADHD as well, and seeing if we can help use that approach in order to get people well, and then to take it one step further and figure out exactly what bacteria are associated, because there is an ick factor with fecal transplant. We do fecal transplant pills. We call them crapsules, and and for sure there's some strangeness, and there's also, you don't know what you don't know, and so lots of things get transferred with fecal transplant. So we're trying to really be precise in identifying the specific bacteria that we hope make people well. So I think that, that's the exciting part of this field for me, is to actually look at it, to expand the treatment options that are available for people. And certainly when I started, most of my colleagues thought that this was the strangest thing ever, and that no one with depression was going to want to take fecal transplant or any of these things. But I think individuals living with the illness, they feel very strongly that there's a connection, and that when they become depressed, their GI symptoms start up in some way. And so I think for them, they'd been told for a long time it was all in your head. And we agreed, it is all in your head, and it's all in your stomach, and we're trying to connect the two. So I think there's much to be excited about in this space, and I think it's one that's growing pretty rapidly.
You made a note about extremely healthy individuals where you would get that fecal transplant potentially from. Can you describe what that might be defined as? Because I'm really curious. Who's that really healthy person?
And if anybody here wants to donate afterwards, please, we are always looking. I sort of say the donors for the fecal transplant program, it's sort of the same as a blood donor. And so if you think about the criteria and the questionnaires that you have to go through in order to be a blood donor, it's the same sorts of things from a infectious disease perspective, and everything is very detailed in terms of the screening. But then it goes even further, because if you think about the illnesses that you're trying to treat, therefore you have to ensure that the donors are free of these illnesses. So for us, we're looking at mental illness. And so our donors cannot have had, on top of the blood donation criteria, they can't have had a mental illness or used psychiatric medication, but nor can any first-degree relatives. And I always joke, that takes out a lot of people, because everybody's got that aunt, right? I am that aunt for some of my family. And then it's use of antibiotics in the last period of time. It's use of probiotics, travel to certain countries where you then get GI illnesses, because we need to make sure that people are extraordinarily healthy. So I think I did pick the one area of research where it's easier to find participants than it actually is to find the healthy individuals. And so when donors are located, they are treated very well. So, because we want them to get excited about this work and to keep being donators. At least it's not painful. It's not like giving blood. So there's some upsides to it.
Okay, so if you want to be a donor, you know to find Dr. Taylor after today's talk. Okay, so let's go back a bit. So kind of during that developmental phase, kind of thinking about how the brain-gut axis can influence brain disorders and the development of them. So I know Chao, with your work at OBI's neurodevelopment program, research program, does neuroinflammation influence neurodevelopmental disorders, and what can be done to address that impact?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, the short answer is that neuroinflammation has been found at the level of the brain, at the level of blood, to be associated with NDD, which is short for neurodevelopmental disorders. And we know this is true. And I wanted to link that actually a bit towards the gut-brain axis that we've been talking about. We know this is true for children living with this disease in Ontario. And this is thanks to the study that supported by OBI and MPOND. We've found that with the 1,700 participants from Ontario, that over almost half of children with autism can have a gut problem, right? Whether it's constipation, diarrhea, refluxes. And this is about 4 times more than a demographically matched, typically developing child. What was really interesting is of those that have the gut symptoms, they tend to score really poorly on social communication. And so this is one way of looking at this gut, brain, and behavior axis. What makes it intriguing is it's not associated with all behavioral deficit, right? Because for an autistic child, you can have social communication problems, anxiety problems, all sorts of behavior deficit, but it's only associated with social communication. So why is that? The third thing we thought was really intriguing was that this finding of association is actually transdiagnostic. So what that means is whether you are diagnosed with autism or ADHD, that association stands true. And so this really brings a new sort of lenses to look at this neurodevelopmental disorder. Not to say that the diagnoses were wrong, but rather there's some commonalities across the diseases. And it'll kind of twist our thinking in terms of treating this type of disorders. So now where's the inflammation component? So that's something that we've been actively working on. From the same participants, we were fortunate to have blood samples to work with. And so far, our indication actually shows there's a particular type of immune flavor called a Th1 response, for those of you that are a little bit in the know for the immunology, that are associated with a gut problem. Of course, by nature of design of this kind of study, it's an association, it's not cause and effect. But what was really interesting is one of the Th1 dominant signature cytokine called interferon gamma was actually previously shown in animal models to actually can cause social interaction problem deficits in these model systems. So what that tells us is maybe these markers we're finding in these human studies could be more than just a marker, and that's really, really exciting for us.
Yeah, and I see a question from our audience that touches or asks a little bit more about the interventional period within this group. Is there a window during development that you might want to target some sort of therapy? And if so, what is that? What is that age or window?
Yeah, that's a very tough question to answer, and I think from every family, you want it to treat as soon as you can, right? And so there are certainly intervention programs, mostly more therapy and that's guided towards improving the social communication or other kind of behavioral deficits. In terms of medical intervention, I know probiotics and that type of treatment is definitely on the horizon, and a lot of families are interested in this type of areas. In terms of medical intervention, there is nothing that's really been approved or proven to work, and that's what makes this line of work really important, because we're looking for clues where you can now tap into a really big basket of immunomodulatory therapies that's being proven safe and effective in a lot of other diseases. And so that's kind of what pumps me into walking into the office every morning and excited about, is that can we pinpoint and find that exact cue and switch that we can help these kids with.
Yeah, so some areas that definitely need a bit more work and discovery, and then you're kind of leading the way in that, so that's really exciting to hear. And then I think now that we think about the early ages, let's move into more of the neurodegeneration side. So what happens, for example, with aging and over time. Premysl, you and your team have done some research into the role of microbiomes playing a role in neurodegeneration. Can you tell us a bit more about what you've discovered?
Sure, and maybe I will still go first to the early age, because we are interested in both ends of life, so early and the late. And there are actually very interesting data coming from a big epidemiological study in Denmark showing that perturbation of microbiota in the first 2 or 3 years of life have really long-standing consequences. So these individuals, these kids, are more likely to develop psychiatric diseases, anxiety, depression, and others. And probably it is this early stage when the neural system is very plastic. So whatever is happening in the gut with the microbiome can have really long-lasting effects. We have actually studied what is the difference. It has been already mentioned by Valerie. That's that germ-free mice behave differently from the conventional ones. And so these were the studies really in notobiotic mice, studying the behavior before and after bacterial colonization. And you can see that just introducing not only the complex or simple microbial community, even a single strain of E. coli, so one strain of bacteria, can change behavior in these mice within 1 or 2 weeks. And it's associated with the changes in brain chemistry, so certain neurotrophins and neurotransmitters change in the brain. And what is very interesting that apart from these ways of communications we were discussing, we were able to show that some specialized immune cells, dendritic cells, during these first few days of colonization can travel from the gut towards the brain, and some of them are even carrying small fragments of bacteria, which is very, very unique. But going to the later stage, it has been known that neural function is changing later in life. So it's called inflammaging, so it's really linked to inflammation, probably dysregulated immune system. And it has been associated with decreased cognition. So we have actually explored it again in these notobiotic mouse models. In McMaster, we have this germ-free facility where the mice are raised in germ-free conditions, and then we can introduce specific bacteria. And it has been already shown by others that if you compare the cognitive skills or the behavior of mice who are young or adults and compared to the ones who are really old, I mean the really senescent mice, there is change in cognition. So they are not able to solve even the simple tasks. Their cognitive performance is decreasing. So we have actually studied in the context of microbiota, and we found that we confirmed first that the conventional mice really, when they are 1.5 years old, their cognition level is decreasing. But surprisingly, you don't see it in the mice of the same age who are raised in germ-free conditions. Now, if you colonize these mice with the microbiota from young mice, they behave similarly to young adults. If you colonize them with the microbiota from the older mice, there you can see the changes in behavior, in cognition. And interestingly, again, it's linked to one of these inflammatory mediators, interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha. And if you block these mediators, you can keep the cognitive function at a better level.
That is really interesting. See, mice can tell you a lot of information, and then playing around with their in different environments is really insightful into cognition and behavior. So kind of continuing to learn more about how we can treat or intervene in this space. This is for you, Valerie. You're working on a very specific treatment that we touched on briefly before. I know we talked about probiotics a bit more too, fecal transplant. But what have you seen that works at home in treating the brain and the gut?
Well, I mean, I think the answers to that are not surprising, and we all know many of these things. Regular sleep, hydration, less processed foods, more kind of green leafy vegetables, things like sauerkraut, kombucha that are very high in fiber. All of those things really make a lot of difference. And of course, they are good for so many things. It's quite funny. I think because the space that I work in, part of the reason we started to do this work is because we know that many of the psychiatric treatments don't work for people. A lot of people don't respond to psychiatric medications or can't tolerate them, or it's very difficult to access some of the talk therapies. And so people start to get desperate and do things on their own. And so I have seen people do home-based fecal transplant, and they send me videos of those, so don't do that, please. But there's also places in the community where you can just go and get fecal transplant, and it really is a little bit of a concern. So right at the beginning of COVID, there was all fecal transplant programs sort of in North America associated with universities were put on pause, and they had to show that all of the donor stool was screened for COVID, because you could theoretically get COVID via fecal transplant. And of course, universities sort of met the bar and then some, and so they all started up again because they had all, really exceeded all of the safety requirements. But there's been 2 deaths of individuals in the U.S. Getting fecal transplant that wasn't appropriately screened and was given into individuals that were immunocompromised. Health Canada shut down a program here in Canada where individuals were recruiting young people with autism and charging parents, and then the children were getting fecal transplant in Tijuana to cure autism. And there actually has been some interesting, autism was probably one of the first areas where fecal transplant was looked at as a treatment, but again, in very safe settings, going to, unregulated places that I think sometimes people think that perhaps because it is kind of viewed as more of a natural thing or a home-based remedy, that it's safe. And it really needs to be done properly. And I try to communicate to people, just like you wouldn't randomly show up and get a blood transfusion from somebody that you didn't know, or a facility that you weren't really sure of how things were screened. Some of these other treatments need to be viewed very much the same way, and that there's a lot of, we're very optimistic about this area, and we're really hopeful that it's going to be a game changer in the mental health space, but there's also places for this to go wrong if not, done properly. So always good common sense needs to be played here. Just from a probiotic perspective, because I know someone's going to ask, there is a lot of research, but not a lot of great outcomes to really inform things with respect to probiotics right now. I think it seems to probably, if it's going to have a place, it's better, just like a healthy diet and other things, at prevention of illness as opposed to treatment of illness. But I think that people are starting to look at more detailed studies to see if there's specific types of probiotics or specific symptoms that might be more open to being changed, but that, unfortunately, we don't have that evidence yet. There's nothing wrong with taking a probiotic, and many people will say that it actually makes them feel better. They feel that it sometimes makes their antidepressants work better because it changes their gut microbiome into something that's going to metabolize things better. And so my advice always is it's probably never going to hurt. And so if people are able to take it, play around with it to see if it can make a difference.
Okay, that's great. And then I want to encourage the audience to keep asking questions. So again, the QR code on the screen, you can email communications@braininstitute.ca. And then if you're online as well, you can continuously send in questions on the right side of your screen. So we're going to move right into audience questions, and I think I'm going to continue to build off of our discussion we've had so far and address some of these. I think I'm going to give this first question to you, Premysl. A lot has been around digestive motility, interestingly enough, in our questions here. Is that caused by inflammation potentially, or that microbiome contributing to how well food moves through your system?
So definitely, I mean, it has been shown that bacteria affect to a great degree the gastrointestinal motility, so the way how the stomach and bowels move the contents towards down. when you actually, again, if you go to the extreme, if you compare germ-free mice against the conventional mice, the germ-free mice have very slow motility, so everything is moving much slower. Now, when you colonize them, again, with microbiota, with different bacteria, you can normalize this aspect of the gut function. What is very interesting, and we did this study actually just a few years ago, each strain of bacteria may have a different effect. So there are some bacteria which make it really fast. Some of them, they just slightly accelerate, and there are some which have very, very little effect. Usually we have really the complex consortia, right? So it will be always the balance between the ones who are kind of pushing for the faster transit and the lower one. But we know also how this happens, and it's more the communication with the enteric nervous system. So basically the complex network of the neurons, which starts basically in the esophagus and goes until the rectum. And it's called actually the second brain, so you have the same amount of neurons in the digestive system compared to the spine. So it's really something to keep in mind. So yes, the bacteria will affect how the bowel functions, and also it will be affected by the diet, because again, when we eat, we are not feeding ourselves, we are also feeding our bacteria. So. Yep. If you think about the bacteria or the microbiome as a metabolic organ, so what goes in will also determine what the bacteria provide us.
For sure.
If I can chime in for a second.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, first of all, that reminds me of the hydra, where the bacteria, the microbes live on hydra, actually help us with motility. But what I wanted to add to that question was about stress. And it's actually, at least demonstrated in the rodents, in mouse models, stress can actually control the enteric nervous system directly, and that alters the way that the gut motility is displayed. And so I think your lifestyle, other than food, can impact that as well.
And that's perfect. It led to the next question that I was going to ask, is more about like the physical components that contribute to the gut-brain axis. So physical activity, everyday interactions. What do we see in that sense with how, I mean, this is pretty broad, but how that impacts your brain-gut axis?
To me, I think when we talk about stress as an example, I think everybody experience and deal with stress very differently. So for some people, this event might appear super stressful because I might have slightly a different way of handling it. So it's not about the strength of the stress, it's about your perceived stress and relaxation, right? It has to reach a balance. So if you're able to find the relevant relaxation methods to counteract it, and I think that in your body will recognize that as a homeostasis in sort of an equilibrium, and you'll be okay with it. So I think we have to tailor all these lifestyle choices based on your individual sense.
Yeah, so no one size fits all.
I don't think so, and the same is true for medicine, as we've been talking about precision medicine for ages, right?
Yep. Just continuing through these questions, I'm really glad that everyone's engaged. I feel like there's a lot of scientists online because we're getting very specific questions here. So I'm going to come back to, you again, Chao. We have a question about what we see in males, that GABAergic neuron effect and astrocytes, and then what we see in women, which is at the microglial side. What does that tell us? Like, why is there that differentiation between the two?
So great question. So what I described is analysis of post-mortem brain samples. It tells a kind of the end result, right? So if you think about cause of depression, which is still unknown, really, it's driven by genetics, stress, a slew of different kind of environmental factors. So I think that sex bias has a lot to do with how women and men handle stress differently. And this is down to the molecular and cellular level. And as we kind of go through life and accumulate this kind of stress, different cells in your brain are burdened with different things, so to speak. So I think that for instance, microglial cells are really important in females because they perceive stress using these type of cells, and they probably create a bit more brain debris, if you will, that accumulates over aging. And one of the jobs of these immune cells is to go and engulf and clear them up. And so I think it has to do with the pathology, and it has to do with which cells get to really respond and become the first line. And it's just fundamentally different between men and women.
Interesting, yeah. It just gets me thinking about how I respond to stress. And that
I mean, I don't want to answer the question about hormone. And of course, everything's going to come down to hormone probably. But beyond hormone, there's these mediators that happen downstream of that. And I think it's really interesting and worth looking into that.
Yeah, no, very interesting. I think a few questions have come from our audience trying to understand how a microbiome differs in those with depression and anxiety versus those without. So I think, Valerie, can you touch on that at all if you know or your work has at least figured out what that is?
For sure. And I mean, I think when there are some infectious diseases, Clostridium difficile, for example, which a C. diff infection, which is an infection that people can acquire in hospital where there's an increase in one particular pathogenic bacteria. And that's very easy to kind of say, okay, this is a bad bacteria. It's not supposed to be there. You got this infection. We have to treat this infection by getting rid of that bad bacteria. And so the difference between illness and healthy is very, very clear. Once we start to get into other types of illnesses, such as depression, it gets much more complicated because it's not simply, I wish it was as simple as there's one bad bacteria we have to remove. It's probably a lot about, we talked about communities and sort of ratios of kind of certain amount of one type of bacteria versus a certain amount of another. And we know that, we have so many bacteria that, and a lot of them do the same things. And so if you have, less of A, it's okay because B, C, and D will do the same thing. We do have some bacteria for which there's less redundancy, and so they have very specific roles, and if they're gone, it's harder for other bacteria to make up the difference, for example. So I think those types of bacteria are probably really important, but we also know, I mentioned something called short-chain fatty acids. And so short-chain fatty acids are really important for brain growth, and they're produced when bacteria breaks down certain foods. If you don't have enough of the bacteria that break down those short-chain fatty acids, you're not going to have as many of them. And so suddenly you're going to be depleted of this specific thing that's really important for brain health, for example. And so, that's an example of something that we might need to look at. We know that, it was mentioned about the concept of medications being broken down by certain bacteria. If you don't have a particular type of bacteria that's really important for activating some of these medications, that you're not going to respond to treatments as well. And perhaps that can be something that's involved. Bacteria, we know we heard Dr. Chao talking about inflammation. Bacteria are very much involved in inflammation. Some of them are pro-inflammatory. They increase inflammation. Some of them decrease inflammation. And, some of the really interesting, consistent findings, for example, is that when people are depressed, there's an increase in bacteria that are involved in inflammation and a decrease in bacteria that are helpful for decreasing inflammation. Diversity is always important, and pretty much consistent with any illness is the whole concept of a healthy person has lots and lots of bacteria, and as they become ill, we start to see some of that diversity just diminishing, and so there's just less of the different types of bacteria. And there have been studies looking at individuals with bipolar disorder, for example, that found that the sicker a person was, the less bacterial diversity they had, and that some of the medications that are often used for bipolar disorder, lithium is a common one, that lithium increased as people got well. Lithium increased bacterial diversity, and then people started to get well. Now, is that kind of wellness associated with the increase in bacterial diversity? We don't know, but that was certainly a common finding. And so I think it's more about kind of very subtle, complex changes in communities, which is why the area that we're focusing on is not on one specific probiotic, but on reintroducing kind of ecosystems of bacteria and trying to reset things.
Yeah, go ahead.
I may add something to this. So I think we have to keep in mind, and these are the data from multiple studies. So if you really want to know whether microbiome is altered in one disease versus the others, usually one study doesn't provide this information, and you have combined these studies together, which is called to create this meta-analysis. And what is being consistently shown, not only for psychiatric diseases, but also gastrointestinal diseases or metabolic syndrome, that there are some mild changes, but always it happens in a proportion of patients. So there will be many patients who will have basically identical microbiome profile as the healthy individuals. So, and this comes to the concept that maybe it's not really who is there, but what they are producing. Again, going back to the metabolites which are produced by the bacteria.
Yeah, and I was going to add that the short fatty chain acid that you refer to helps brain grow is actually an important, really important metabolite that drives expansion of regulatory T cells, which are the kind of immune cells that withhold inflammation. And so I think these are all really interesting axes with the same common mediator.
Yeah, so I have two thoughts that come from our audience questions. So the first is, where would you get the best source of those fatty acid chains?
So your body actually do produce them.
Okay.
But the fact that you have trillion microbial cells in the digestive system, they certainly are a very formidable force of short fatty chain acid. But in other parts of your body, you have your stromal cells. That's certainly a really rich source of that. And they're in the brain, for instance, astrocytes is kind of the energy hub within the brain, and then they do make these short chain fatty acids as well.
Great, awesome. And then the second part is, how does genetics influence how individuals respond to either the stressor that impacts the gut-brain axis, or even treatments in general?
Yeah. I mean, it's probably a question more open for the whole panel. But from my experience, that for psychiatric disorders, and now we've just begun to understand the genetic architecture of what drives that. And so the first done in schizophrenia, and then more recently for major depressive disorder as well. When you look at the genetic architecture, there's a lot of similarities between that amongst the mood disorders, but also with neurodevelopmental disorders. And you might be surprised to hear that some of that architecture is linked to some completely irrelevant disease, like immune-mediated diseases, and then gut diseases as well. And so that tells us not just all the symptomology that we've been discussing, but at a genetic level, there's some sort of etiological link between these axes that we've been talking about.
Interesting. Did anyone else want to expand on that one?
Yeah. Well, for the gastrointestinal diseases, for some of them, there is a definitely strong genetic background, whether it's, celiac disease, IBD, inflammatory bowel disease with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. But in others, these disorders of gut-brain interaction, like irritable bowel syndrome, it's mainly the environment which is probably creating. There is very little role of genetic factors in it. And again, going back to IBD, as has already been said, it's mainly linked to the genes. Now for IBD, it's around 400 different genes, which are related to bacterial recognition, handling of bacteria, or some mechanisms related to gut permeability.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I mean, it's really interesting to consider how, exactly what potential diseases you may have that impacts your brain health, and then, of course, therapies. There's a common question here that's come up about some of those behavioral therapies, or working with patients more externally and through therapy in general, and how that kind of reflects in gut health. I don't know if, Valerie, you can touch on that based off of your work or what you've experienced.
I think it's really an interesting question. It is something that we're in the process of looking at, because to say, your gut bacteria are involved in depression, and then you take a medication and your gut bacteria change and you get well, you've you've taken something orally, that's going to change your gut bacteria. One of the things that we're in the concept or in the process of looking at right now, there's a couple therapies for different psychiatric illness called neuromodulation therapy. So RTMS, or reversible transcranial magnetic stimulation, which you put magnets on your head to treat depression, is fairly commonly used. And then a more kind of invasive version of that is electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. And so we're in the process of getting microbiome samples from individuals before they start RTMS or ECT, and then when they're finished, and having a look at, is there a change in the gut bacteria of people who have magnets on their head, or electroshock currents? Because there shouldn't be, unless the actual part of the illness involves brain behavior. We're in conversation right now with Sunnybrook Hospital, where they have a really robust program to do talk therapy, very detailed talk therapy for OCD. OCD is one of the illnesses, obsessive compulsive disorder. Sunnybrook is kind of known for treating, and we're going to be doing the same thing, looking at the gut bacteria before and after this talk therapy. And if the gut bacteria change after talk therapy when people get well, I think it's a strong indication of just the role of bacteria in this illness, because it shouldn't change unless it's part of what's the underlying pathology. So you have to all come back next year, and we will have that information. But I think it's really important to be able to kind of answer some of those questions about just how bacteria are involved by looking at kind of what happens before and after some of these non-gut-based treatments.
Mm-hmm. No, very interesting. And yeah, definitely want to hear what the results of that work is in a year. I think the other part that I'm getting in these questions is, what about what we're putting into our bodies, the food that we're eating, the diet that we have? How does that kind of relate to either manifesting in some sort of psychiatric disorder, or just changing that axis? Can be an inflammatory response as well, that you commonly see in your work. So I don't, Premak, did you have any insight on diet, ketogenic, fasting,
So diet, I mean, it has been shown in preclinical studies, I mean, in mice and also in humans, that diet, especially the long-term diet, is the most important determinant of microbiota composition, but also activity. So if you change your diet, you will change also your microbiome. If you travel, if you go somewhere, you start tasting different foods, it will affect your microbiota. So yes, it plays an important role, and whether there is any, the best diet, I guess, it's difficult. So there are some clinical studies showing that Mediterranean diet is probably this well balanced, which has overall health benefit, but it's really difficult to recommend one diet in general. Some patients perceive that excluding certain food components make them feel better. Sometimes it's well justified. Definitely for patients with celiac disease, they should avoid gluten. In other cases, it may be really in the microbiome or the signal, but sometimes it's also related to the beliefs, right? Because we get influenced by what is happening around us, by media. So this is a very, very interesting and hot topic, at least in gastroenterology. What kind of diets to recommend, and it has been recognized that even for the purely inflammatory diseases like IBD, the role has an important role and can help with, in maybe not achieving remission, but at least maintaining patients in remission when the medications actually calm down the initial inflammation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think a lot of questions that I'm seeing from the audience is, how do you know it's working? Like, if you change your diet, how do you know it's working? If you take a probiotic, how do you know it's working? Or can you go and get your microbiome analyzed? Like, is that something you can do?
May I just?
Yeah.
I will answer just about the testing of the microbiome, because
Sure, yeah.
there is lots of information on internet, what is healthy, what is unhealthy, but there is actually no scientific data, and we don't know really what is normal, what is healthy, what is unhealthy, and even more, we don't know how to test it, right? So there are many commercial kits, tests which you can do, and you can spend hundreds of dollars on that, and you will get very long list of bacteria which are higher and lower. And I see many patients coming to the clinic and showing me the results, and I say, I don't know, right? It's in the context, and usually this kind of testing is more kind of superficial level. So if you want really to understand what is happening, you need to know not only what kind of group of bacteria, but the specific bacteria and the genes, especially the enzymes which the specific bacteria possess. This will probably make the impact. So at this time, I would recommend against any testing, like this.
Yeah. I wish that it were that simple, and I tell people it's very much like, it's the same as getting an astrological chart read. The science is about the same, unfortunately. For us, when we do some of our microbiome analysis, we have to get samples kind of within 3 hours, because a lot of your bacteria are anaerobic. As soon as it hits oxygen, you're going to start to see lots of them die. We usually get people to immediately put them into specific kind of kits that have preservatives, different kinds of factors in them, and put the lid on. They have to come to us to be processed very, very quickly. And the types of analysis that are done by facilities like the one that Premysl works at are not the kinds of places that are going to be doing those kinds of analysis. It's a completely different thing. And we'd also need to know the food that somebody was eating in order to understand things, even if we could do all of that testing. But if do you know if your microbiome is changing, or you have a good microbiome or bad microbiome? That's sort of not available on a large scale kind of way. But if you change your diet and you feel better, it's working. If you think that if you're having trouble sleeping and you feel fatigued, you feel like you are struggling with the onset of depression, you make changes, you start to exercise, you change up what you're eating, you do other things, and you don't feel those ways anymore, then it's working. And so it's sort of psychiatry is it's very lovely that way. We have no tests. And it's like, do you feel better? It's working. And so sometimes that's extraordinarily frustrating, because when people don't feel better, we unfortunately don't yet have blood tests or things to be able to say, well, this is why. And so, there's also that con associated with the pro of, oh, you feel better, great, it worked. But there's also some real interest in sophisticated analysis of the microbiome to perhaps at some point be able to use some of the factors that the bacteria are producing to perhaps identify a biomarker that might tell us if a particular medication or a particular approach is going to work. We're not there yet, but again, I think there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. The science has improved so much. In 10 years, I hope 10 years from now, we will be able to, there will be a kit or something that you can do within a doctor's office. It's going to be able to use your microbiome just like you look at a blood sample or something else. And so, I think that all of the work that great scientists on this stage are doing is getting us closer to that, but save your money for now.
Another question or set of questions that we're getting is about some of the more traumatic brain injury-based questions, as well as those around cognitive decline later in life. What work are we seeing with how the gut plays a role in that? I don't know if, Premysl, you've seen it in your work, or in the inflammation space. Dr. Wang, you've seen anything as well?
Yeah, it's not an area that I actually work on, especially the link between gut. I'm not aware of any particularly good evidence towards that, but certainly the immune system is playing a huge role in brain trauma, because they're needed. The first wave that's come in is going to be your macrophages that helps stitches things up and kind of remodel everything back to its normal, or as normal as it can be. So I think it's just a very active area of research.
You would know a lot about the pain space and the gut microbiome.
Yes and no. I mean, I think there are a lot of crosstalk in that space, in the sense that immune cells can make mediators that can influence our pain. So whether it can, sometimes in situations they actually can amplify pain, and sometimes they lessens it. So I think in that sense they are connected to the traumas.
I mean, I cannot really comment on any traumatic events. I mean, it's. I do know. I mean, that there is at least it was one study which showed that at least in a experimental model of stroke, you can have some immune cells which originate in the gut appear in the brain, and again, it was one study so far. I mean, I would just more comment on the pain. I mean, what we just heard. Yes, I mean, bacteria can produce molecules which directly interact with the nociceptive neurons, so neurons which sense pain, and we have published already a few years ago now bacteria which, study where we discovered bacteria producing a large amount of histamine. And again, histamine is one of the main pain mediators. Now, actually, this is a topic of our current research, looking at other mediators which the bacteria can produce and which are already linked to, for example, neuropathic pain in humans.
Yeah, so understanding what the bacteria, these microbiomes, are, how they're interacting as well as what they're producing, is becoming a kind of the hot topic or area to look at.
And it's not necessarily that the bacteria are producing some bad molecules, some pro-nociceptive mediators. There is a study actually from France showing that some patients with irritable bowel syndrome will have lower levels of anti-nociceptive molecules. So bacteria probably in some individuals, or actually probably most of us, produce some molecules which can decrease the pain sensation in the gut. And if you have less of these bacteria or less of these metabolites, this is when the pain will be more prominent.
So those with IBS might be linked to greater pain or susceptibility to pain. Very interesting. Would not have thought of that. That's really cool. That's what's great about this space. So a few other questions here. We do have about 10 minutes left, so I do encourage the audience members to continuously send in questions if you have any more. So one other one that came up, going back to neurodevelopment, Dr. Wang, have you thought about looking at it like in pregnancy and understanding what that looks like in the actual womb?
That's a great question. And so I think it really all started because of a series of mouse model studies where it has shown if there's an infection during pregnancy in the rodent system, that can lead to the offspring later on develop more anxiety and autistic-like behavior, if you will. And there's subsequent analysis by the same group, actually, Junha and co-leaders, where they show that in the same passage, you actually end up transferring the gut abnormality from the mother to offspring as well, which is quite incredible. And they also discovered that while the autistic-like behavior transfer happens during pregnancy, the gut symptom transfers actually after pregnancy. And this is probably because of the feeding with the milk and then transfer of some of the immune cells in this process. And so through these studies, and I think one of the major culprits that came out is a cytokine called IL-17, If you block that, you can actually stop the offspring from developing these kind of symptoms. And they've also shown that the cytokine can act on specific neurons in the brain. And if you remove the responsiveness receptor from the neurons, you can then again devoid of that problem. So it's interesting through these mouse studies that we're kind of teasing apart specific inflammatory component that could be very pathogenic in this context. And so, so later on, this has manifested into other type of studies, and I know you can transfer sort of a pregnant mom's antibodies into, I think this is done in primate studies, where they can now transfer that anxiety level behavior and kind of implant it into a primate. And so there's definitely kind of a causal link when inflammation goes haywire. But I guess we have to be careful here that not all inflammation is bad. Like I mentioned before, that it is really specific switches that could be very important in this context.
Yeah, wow, very interesting. I mean, it's, yeah, that inflammatory response during pregnancy is important. We had a few questions about, like, premature babies. Like, is there an impact there? Maybe the passage of a leaky gut, is that common at all?
Yeah, well, that's totally beyond my depth.
I figured. I was like, this is pretty broad, so I try to address it.
But if I were to guess, if that accompanies with an abundance of IL-17, then it would, right? I guess you could have that kind of inflammatory cytokine without an infection. Right? When you do have a leaky gut, we know actually what was kind of counterintuitive, that the cytokine can actually help maintain a gut health. It's very important for your epithelial cell function and balance. And the cells that makes them can also make other things that are really good for your gut as well, like IL-22, and these are all homeostatic cytokines that kind of maintain that barrier function. So I think more research is needed. I mean, it's not really a hand waver, but I think it's, for us, this is
Do you want to add?
If I may add more from the GI point of view, the gastrointestinal diseases. So premature babies are actually at high risk of developing what is called necrotizing enterocolitis, and this is really a severe disease. It can have really fatal consequences. And there is actually what we were speaking about, the probiotics, whether they work in different diseases or not. There is actually substantial evidence that if you give the probiotics, whether these are the bifidobacterial lactobacilli, to these babies, you can actually prevent development of this disorder, of this necrotizing enterocolitis. So again, the early intervention, at least at the gut level, can be very beneficial.
No, very interesting. And I think it kind of goes into the next question that I see in here, is that, like, what about antibiotic use? I think we were chatting about it with Valerie too before. Does that play a role, using antibiotics to help with gut health and brain health at the same time?
Well, I think, the whole role of antibiotics are to reduce certain bacteria in some way. And so there's been some work to show that antibiotics, it's sort of anecdotally, I sort of started this whole area of research after I had 2 clinical interactions where 2 of my patients who had been very ill for a long period of time and nothing worked, both of them got remarkably better after taking antibiotics. One actually had a pneumonia, one had a minor surgical procedure, and they both immediately had their symptoms disappear. And they had asked if they got well because they took antibiotics. And I said, I have no idea. And I said, but we'll try to find out. And that sort of led me to really pivot my research career. For one of them, both of them after about a month and a half, became unwell again. One of them we re-challenged with an antibiotic, and the second time we didn't get a response. And so, was it specific bacteria that were then gone? I don't think we know. There's a really interesting psychiatric disorder called PANDAS, which specifically is associated with the onset of psychiatric symptoms, specifically OCD, sometimes tics in kids, linked to a streptococcus infection. And one of the treatments for PANDAS is antibiotics. And if you treat the strep infection quickly enough, that the symptoms go away. Not always, but sometimes. And so it's this really interesting link. But if you treat pandas for too long with antibiotics, it's going to have negative effects on the bacterial profile, and the children start to get unwell in different ways depending on kind of the bacteria that are impacted. So I think that, you know, again, what it goes to show is that there's an impact on illness presentation when you manipulate your microbiome in some way, whether or not it's giving antibiotics that take certain things out, giving fecal transplant that changes it. There seems to be an association. Exactly how that works and why that works, I don't think we know yet.
Yeah, very
I
interesting.
may still add to this, because with the antibiotics, it can go also the other way, right?
Exactly. It can
It
be
has been
bad or
described, I mean,
pro or
in
con.
patients who are taking antibiotics for different causes, they can develop what is called antibiotic-induced psychosis. So suddenly they start behaving differently, and when you stop the antibiotics, they become behaving normally. But there is actually a very strong example how antibiotics can affect the way how we behave. And this is in the context of end-stage liver disease. Some of the patients who have already severe cirrhosis, they develop what is called hepatic encephalopathy. They have different level of cognition, and in severe cases, it can really, they can be in coma. They are completely unresponsive. And what is interesting that, and this is known already for decades and decades, so when you, in these patients, you can either treat them with colonic lavage, give them basically the clean their bowels, or you give them antibiotics, and within few hours, these patients are speaking to you normally. Wow. Okay, so it shows that really in that case, probably the liver, which works like a filter, is damaged, and when we have this the blood actually from bowels goes through other pathways, can reach the brain, and it contains some bacteria metabolites which really put these patients asleep, you know, and so I think this is probably one of the most known examples how gut bacteria really affect the way how we behave.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, we learned quite a bit. We went everywhere from the basics to how it impacts brain health, psychiatric conditions, what we eat, and treatments that we can take to approach brain health. I do want to finish with the last word from each of you. What do you want our audience to leave with today from today's discussion? We'll start with Dr. Wang.
So other than to tell you to eat well and sleep well, I would call for what you're doing today. Come out here, engage with clinicians, scientists, talk to each other. I think it's a really kind of a team science environment as a scientist that I look forward to, because it touched ground for me and also really raised the impact of what we're doing here. So keep on coming to these events.
Dr. Taylor?
You know, I think that there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. Funny enough, the original way in which we conceptualized mental illness, like 150 years ago, people thought it was because of toxins in your GI system, and that's why people developed anxiety or depression. And now we've kind of come full circle because the science has matured, and now we know we can see the things in our GI system that we're talking about, and we can do mouse studies and all of that work. And so, you know, I think that as the science evolves, the field is going to evolve, and hopefully we'll get better answers and better treatments. And so I think that there is a lot to really be excited about in this space.
Yeah, and Dr. Bercik?
Well, I would like also to finish on a positive note, because we have learned so much during the last, I would say, 2 decades on the microbiome and the role of gut bacteria in our health. And it started with studies, showing different associations. But during the especially last few years, we are really learning the specific mechanisms, how the molecular pathways through which the bacteria can communicate within the gut to the other organs and to the brain. So I would really share the optimism with Valerie that probably in next 5-10 years, we will really have some diagnostic test kits which will help us to understand what is the specific, not maybe bacteria, but the specific metabolite, a specific pathway which is affected, and then treat it, whether it's dietary intervention, whether there will be new probiotics, or even we will not be doing FMT in future, but there may be some synthetic consortia. So several, groups of bacteria which can work together and which can address the problem in that individual patients. And again, it has to go to this concept of precision medicine, because this current treatment we are using, so one size fits all, really will not make it. So we have really to go to the individualized diagnosis and treatment.
Yeah, what a great positive way to end the panel for today. And I'm really excited for the work that'll come in the next 5 to 10 years. And again, on behalf of the Ontario Brain Institute, I would like to thank everyone for attending today's talk and those online with us. Thank you to our panelists. A round of applause for them. Just by the slew of questions I got, you all were really engaged, and I think that's really important to the success of events such as this. We have some resources to share with you for more information around this topic. We will also post them on the screen shortly, and a complete list is also available on the OBI website, braininstitute.ca. Under resources, you can go in, you can click under these OBI Public Talks, and then it'll take you to a page that offers you more of these resources. Your feedback is super valuable to us, so you should see a feedback form or sheet on your chair if you're here in the room with us, or if you're online, there's a survey link available to you in the chat box. Please share your thoughts, give us more feedback, and any other things that you're interested in learning more about. The OBI Public Talks are designed to share the latest knowledge on brain health and to offer simple tips to manage both health and wellness. Our next talk, AI and Brain Health, the second in our Breakthroughs in Brain Science series, is set for November 2025. Not a specific date yet, but November 2025, and we really hope to see you there. That's a great topic to go into. And finally, I would like to invite everyone gathered here today to join us in person in our reception room, or for our reception in the library room in Snell Hall. And to all our audience members, thank you again and have a great night.